The blood on Victoria Graham's hands had frozen in the December cold before she even realized she was running, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the snow-laden streets of Independence, California, leaving crimson prints that the falling snow mercifully began to cover within moments of her passing. Behind her lay everything she had ever known, a life that had shattered in the space of a single gunshot, and ahead stretched only the vast unknown of the Sierra Nevada wilderness in the winter of 1878. She had killed her husband in self-defense, but no jury in Inyo County would believe that a woman could be justified in shooting Jacob Graham, respected merchant and pillar of the community, even if the bruises hidden beneath her high-collared dress told a different story than his public facade. Victoria had been 22 years old when she married Jacob 3 years ago, believing his promises of security and devotion, never imagining that behind closed doors he would become a monster who saw her as property to be controlled and punished. Tonight he had gone too far, his hands around her throat, squeezing until darkness crept into the edges of her vision, and she had grabbed the Derringer from the desk drawer, the one he kept for protection against bandits. The look of surprise on his face as the bullet entered his chest would haunt her forever, but not as much as the certainty that staying would mean her own death, either at the end of a rope or at his hands if he somehow survived. The snow fell heavier now, thick flakes that clung to her dark hair and the thin shawl she had grabbed as she fled. She wore no coat, had taken nothing but the dress on her back, and the few dollars she kept hidden in her pocket for emergencies. Her plan, if it could be called that, was to reach the livery stable at the edge of town, take a horse, and disappear into the mountains before anyone discovered Jacob's body. It was suicide, she knew, to venture into the high country in the middle of winter with no supplies and no experience, but the alternative was worse. The stable loomed ahead, a dark shape against the white landscape, and Victoria forced her trembling legs to move faster. Her fingers were numb, her feet soaked through her inadequate boots, but fear drove her forward. She had just reached the stable door when she heard the shout behind her, someone calling for the sheriff, and her heart seized with terror. They had found him already, found Jacob lying in his study with her gone, and now they would come for her with dogs and guns and righteous fury. Victoria wrenched open the stable door and stumbled inside, the warmth of the animals' bodies barely registering as she searched desperately for a horse that was saddled, or at least bridled. Her hands shook so badly she could hardly work the leather straps, and she was on the verge of giving up, of simply lying down in the hay and waiting for capture, when a voice spoke from the shadows. "You are making a mess of that bridle, and even if you got it on, that mare would throw you before you made it a mile in this weather." Victoria spun around, her heart hammering, and found herself facing a man who had apparently been sleeping in one of the empty stalls. He rose to his feet with the easy grace of someone accustomed to bedding down in strange places, and even in the dim light filtering through the stable's cracks, she could see he was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that assessed her with neither judgment nor sympathy, only a calculating interest. "Please," Victoria whispered, hating the desperation in her voice. "I need a horse. I have money, not much, but I will pay whatever you want." The man tilted his head, studying her torn dress, her bare hands stained with blood that the snow had not entirely washed away, and the wild panic in her eyes. "What you need is a miracle, not a horse. The pass is closed with snow, the temperature is dropping fast enough to kill an experienced traveler, and unless I miss my guess, there will be men with torches coming through that door in about 5 minutes looking for whoever left those tracks you made." Victoria felt tears sting her eyes, hot against her frozen cheeks. Then I am dead either way. At least in the snow it will be quick. Not necessarily. The man moved closer, and Victoria fought the urge to back away. He smelled of horse and leather and wood smoke. And despite everything, there was something solid and real about his presence that made her want to trust him, though she had learned the hard way that trusting men led only to suffering. My name is Franklin Davis, and I am what you might call a man with flexible morals and a talent for disappearing. If you want to live through this night, you will do exactly as I say without question or hesitation. Can you do that? Victoria met his eyes, searching for deceit or cruelty, and finding only a calm pragmatism that suggested he had been in tight situations before and survived them. She had no reason to trust this stranger, no guarantee he would not simply turn her over to the sheriff for whatever reward might be offered, but standing here debating her options was not a choice she could afford. Yes, she said simply. Franklin nodded once, decisive. Good. Take off that shawl and dress. They are too distinctive and soaked through besides. Victoria's hands went to her collar protectively, and Franklin made an impatient sound. I have no interest in your virtue, woman. I am trying to save your life. There are spare clothes in my bedroll, men's things, but they will fit well enough and keep you warmer. Move quickly. We have no time. The shouts outside were growing louder, and Victoria realized he was right. Modesty was a luxury she could not afford. She turned her back and with shaking fingers began to unfasten the buttons of her dress, hearing Franklin rummaging through his belongings behind her. When the dress fell to her feet, revealing the chemise and petticoats beneath, he thrust a bundle of clothes at her without looking. Put these on. Leave the undergarments. They will only get in the way and mark you as female if anyone looks too close. Victoria's face burned with embarrassment, but she did as instructed, stripping down to her skin in the freezing stable and pulling on the rough wool pants, the flannel shirt, and the heavy coat he provided. They smelled of him, tobacco and sage and something indefinably masculine, and they were too large but blessedly warm. Franklin handed her a hat next, and she tucked her long hair up under it as best she could. Good enough, Franklin said, giving her a critical look. You are still too pretty by half, but in the dark you might pass for a young man. Now listen carefully. There is a horse outside tied to the back of the stable, a dun gelding with good mountain sense. You are going to walk out the back door, mount that horse, and ride north along the creek bed. Do not stop, do not look back, just ride. I will catch up with you before dawn. What about you? Victoria asked, confused. They will question you, they will know you helped me. Franklin's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. They will question a drifter who was sleeping off too much whiskey and saw nothing. I have played that role before and I can play it again. Now go, before they surround the building. Victoria wanted to thank him, to ask why he was helping her, to demand more answers about what would happen next, but the sound of boots crunching through snow and men's voices shouting instructions spurred her into action. She slipped out the back door of the stable, found the dun gelding exactly where Franklin had said, and hauled herself into the saddle with graceless urgency. The horse snorted but responded to the pressure of her heels, moving forward into the darkness and the snow. She had ridden before, though Jacob had discouraged it as unladylike, and she knew enough to give the horse its head and trust it to find its footing. The creek bed was a pale ribbon through the darkness, and she followed it north as instructed, every muscle tensed for the sound of pursuit. Behind her, she heard shouts and the glow of torches as the searchers entered the stable, but no one called out in alarm. No one seemed to notice the horse moving away through the night. Victoria rode for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, her body growing numb with cold despite the coat, her mind blank with exhaustion and shock. She had killed a man tonight, her own husband, and though part of her insisted it was justified, another part whispered that she was damned now, marked as a murderer and a fugitive. When the horse finally slowed to a walk, picking its way carefully along the frozen creek bank, she did not urge it faster. She simply held on and tried to keep breathing. The snow had stopped falling when Franklin appeared out of the darkness ahead, mounted on a rangy bay horse and leading a pack mule. Victoria's hand went instinctively to the horse's reins, ready to flee, but Franklin merely gestured for her to follow and turned his horse west, away from the creek and into the trees. She hesitated only a moment before obeying, too exhausted to question and too desperate to refuse help. They rode in silence through a landscape transformed by snow into something alien and beautiful and deadly. The moonlight reflecting off the white ground provided enough illumination to navigate by, and the horses seemed sure-footed despite the conditions. Victoria had no idea where they were going or what Franklin's plan might be, but she clung to the saddle and followed his broad-shouldered form through the trees. When Franklin finally stopped, the sky was beginning to lighten with the gray promise of dawn. They were in a sheltered hollow surrounded by pine trees, a place that was partially protected from the wind and had enough dry ground beneath the branches to make camp. Franklin dismounted and began unpacking the mule with efficient movements, and after a moment, Victoria slid from her horse as well, her legs nearly buckling when they hit the ground. "See to the horses," Franklin said without looking at her. "There is a brush in the left saddlebag and some grain in one of the packs. They have earned it tonight." Victoria's hands were clumsy with cold and fatigue, but she did her best to care for the animals, removing their saddles and rubbing them down before spreading grain on a flat rock. Franklin had built a small fire by the time she finished, barely more than a flicker of flame that gave off surprisingly little smoke, and he was brewing coffee in a battered tin pot. "Sit before you fall down," he said, and Victoria gratefully sank onto a fallen log near the fire. The warmth felt like heaven against her frozen skin, and when Franklin handed her a cup of black coffee, she wrapped her hands around it and breathed in the bitter steam. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. Finally, Franklin spoke. "Are you going to tell me what you did, or do I have to guess?" Victoria stared into her coffee, watching the dark surface ripple with her trembling. "I killed my husband. He was hurting me, he would have killed me, and I shot him. There is nothing more to tell." "There is always more to tell," Franklin said mildly. "But that is enough for now. You should know that by helping you, I have made myself an accessory to murder in the eyes of the law. I have no particular love for the law, but it does mean our fates are tied together now, at least until we can get you somewhere safe." "Why?" Victoria asked, finally looking up at him. In the growing dawn light, she could see his face more clearly, the strong jaw shadowed with stubble, the deep-set eyes that were a surprising shade of hazel, the thin scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. He looked like a man who had lived hard and expected no mercy from the world. "Why would you help me? You do not know me, you have no reason to risk yourself." Franklin was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Let us just say I have little sympathy for men who beat women, and I am not overly concerned with the law's version of justice. I have been on the wrong side of it enough times myself to know it rarely has much to do with what is right." "Are you an outlaw?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I am a man who has done what was necessary to survive," Franklin replied. "I have worked as a ranch hand, a scout, a gambler, and yes, occasionally I have relieved people of property they did not guard well enough. But I am not a killer and I do not make war on women. That is all you need to know about me." Victoria nodded slowly, accepting this. She was in no position to judge anyone else's choices, and at least Franklin had been honest with her. "Where are we going?" "For now, deeper into the mountains. They will search the valleys and the main trails first, expecting you to try to reach another town. We are going to do the opposite, head up into country so rough they will not think anyone could survive there in winter. Once the initial search dies down, we will circle around and make for Nevada. I have friends there who will not ask questions." "I do not think I can make it," Victoria said quietly. "I have never been in the mountains in winter. I have no experience with this kind of travel. I will slow you down and probably get us both killed." Franklin leaned forward, his eyes catching hers and holding them. "You made it through last night, did you not? You kept your head when you could have panicked, you followed orders without arguing, and you took care of the horses before yourself, even though you were half frozen. That tells me you have more strength than you think. The question is whether you want to live badly enough to keep going when it gets hard." Victoria thought about Jacob's hands around her throat, about the years of fear and pain and humiliation she had endured, about the empty future that had stretched before her as his wife. "I want to live," she said firmly. "I want to be free. If that means following you into the mountains, then that is what I will do." "Good," Franklin said, and this time his smile was real, warming his austere features. "Then drink your coffee and get some rest. We will move again in a few hours, and I need you alert and ready to ride." Victoria obeyed, draining the bitter coffee and wrapping herself in the blanket Franklin provided. She lay down near the fire, her body aching and her mind spinning with everything that had happened, but exhaustion claimed her quickly. Her last thought before sleep took her was that Franklin Davis was either her salvation or another kind of danger, and she was too tired to determine which. When Franklin woke her, the sun was high overhead, though the gray clouds promised more snow before nightfall. Victoria sat up groggily, disoriented for a moment before memory crashed back, and she remembered where she was and why. Franklin handed her a piece of dried meat and some hardtack, not much of a breakfast, but she ate it gratefully, suddenly aware that she had not eaten since yesterday noon. "We have maybe 2 hours before the next storm hits," Franklin said as he saddled the horses. "There is a line shack about 6 miles west of here, an old shelter that the cattlemen use during summer grazing. It will be rough, but it has walls and a roof, and we can hole up there until the weather clears." Victoria helped him pack up the camp, following his lead and trying to learn the small tasks that would make her useful rather than a burden. Franklin worked with economical efficiency, wasting no movement, and she found herself watching him with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. He was probably in his late 20s, she guessed, though his weathered face made it hard to tell. There was something self-contained about him, a sense that he needed no one and expected nothing from the world, and she wondered what had made him that way. The ride to the line shack was brutal. The wind picked up as Franklin had predicted, driving needles of ice into any exposed skin, and the horses struggled through drifts that grew deeper with each mile. Victoria's fingers went numb inside the gloves Franklin had given her, and her face felt like it was on fire from the cold. But she gritted her teeth and kept riding, determined not to complain or show weakness. When the line shack finally appeared through the blowing snow, it looked like the most beautiful building Victoria had ever seen. It was little more than a crude log structure with a single door and no windows. But when Franklin pushed the door open, the interior was dry and out of the wind. They led the horses inside, grateful that the structure was large enough to accommodate the animals, and Franklin immediately began building a fire in the rough stone hearth. The smoke made Victoria's eyes water, but the warmth was worth it. She helped Franklin unsaddle the horses and spread their gear out to dry, moving mechanically through the tasks. When everything was settled, Franklin produced more dried meat and some beans, which he set to cooking over the fire. "We will stay here at least 2 days," Franklin said, stirring the pot. "Maybe 3 if the storm is as bad as I think it will be. That should give the initial search time to lose steam, and it will give you time to learn some of the skills you will need." "What kind of skills?" Victoria asked, sitting cross-legged near the fire and holding her hands out to the flames. "How to start a fire in wet conditions, how to read the weather, how to find food and water when there is none obvious, how to move quietly and leave minimal tracks. If we are going to make it to Nevada alive, you need to be able to take care of yourself. I cannot watch over you every moment." Victoria bristled slightly at the implication that she was helpless, but she forced herself to nod. He was right. She was helpless in this environment, utterly dependent on him for survival. If she wanted to truly be free, she needed to change that. "Teach me," she said. "I will learn whatever you think I need to know." Franklin looked at her appraisingly, as if reassessing his earlier judgment. "All right then, we will start with the basics." The next 2 days passed in a blur of lessons and survival. Franklin was a patient but demanding teacher, showing Victoria how to build different types of fires, how to identify edible plants even in winter, how to read animal tracks and weather signs. He taught her to move through the forest without breaking branches or leaving obvious traces, to listen for the sounds that meant danger, to trust her instincts when something felt wrong. Victoria absorbed everything like a woman dying of thirst, her mind sharp despite her exhaustion. She had spent so many years living in fear, confined to the narrow world Jacob allowed her, that this new knowledge felt like power flowing into her veins. She was still terrified of what lay ahead, still haunted by nightmares of Jacob's face and the weight of the gun in her hand, but she was also beginning to feel something else beneath the fear. Hope, perhaps, or determination. The sense that she might actually survive this and build a life beyond the reach of her past. Franklin watched her progress with approval, though he rarely offered praise. He seemed to be a man of few words, speaking only when necessary and never wasting breath on empty reassurances or meaningless conversation. But Victoria found she preferred his honesty to false comfort. When he said she had done well, she knew he meant it. On the 3rd morning, they woke to clear skies and bitter cold. Franklin declared it time to move, and they set out before dawn, heading northwest through country that grew progressively rougher and more remote. They saw no signs of pursuit, no distant smoke or tracks that suggested other travelers, and Victoria began to allow herself to believe they might actually escape. As they rode, Victoria found herself talking to Franklin more, asking questions about his life and his travels. He was reluctant to share at first, deflecting her curiosity with vague answers, but gradually he began to open up. She learned that he had been born in Missouri, that his family had been killed by raiders during the war when he was 15, that he had drifted west with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning desire to leave the past behind. "I spent some time as a scout for the Army," Franklin said one evening as they made camp in a grove of aspens, "mostly tracking hostiles and guiding supply trains. The pay was terrible and the officers were idiots, so I moved on. Worked cattle drives for a while, saved up enough money to try my hand at prospecting. That did not work out, so I tried gambling. That worked out too well, if you understand my meaning. Men do not like to lose to someone they think is cheating, even when they are wrong." Were you cheating?" Victoria asked, curious. Franklin's mouth quirked. "Not always. I am good with cards. I have a memory for what has been played and a sense for when to bet and when to fold. But sometimes a man gets dealt a losing hand no matter how clever he is, and other times the temptation to improve your odds is hard to resist. I have done my share of both." Victoria found herself smiling at his candor. "You are honest about being dishonest. I appreciate that." "No point in pretending to be something I am not," Franklin said with a shrug. "The world is full enough of liars without adding one more. What about you? What was your life like before you married?" Victoria's smile faded. "Ordinary. I lived with my parents in Sacramento, helped my mother with sewing and housework, attended church on Sundays. My father worked as a clerk in a shipping office. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable. When Jacob came to visit on business and expressed interest in me, my parents were thrilled. He seemed respectable, successful, kind. They encouraged the match, and I thought I was lucky to have attracted such a man's attention." She laughed bitterly. "I was such a fool." "You were young and trusting," Franklin said quietly. "That does not make you a fool, it makes you human. The fault lies with him, not with you." Victoria looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "You say that as if you mean it." "I do mean it. I have seen enough of the world to know that evil comes in respectable packages just as often as in the form of outlaws and savages. More often, maybe, because the respectable ones have the power of society behind them. Your husband was a coward who used his position to abuse someone weaker, and you did what you had to do to survive. Do not waste time feeling guilty about that." His words settled something in Victoria's chest, easing a knot of shame and doubt she had been carrying. "Thank you," she said softly. Franklin nodded and returned his attention to the fire, but Victoria continued to watch him, seeing him with new eyes. He was not a conventionally handsome man, his features too harsh and weathered for that, but there was something compelling about him nonetheless. A strength and competence that made her feel safe for the first time in years. She found herself wondering what it would be like to be close to such a man, not as a prisoner or a possession, but as an equal partner. The thought made her blush, and she quickly looked away before he could notice. As the days passed and they traveled deeper into the wilderness, Victoria became increasingly aware of Franklin's presence in ways that had nothing to do with survival. She noticed the way his hands moved when he worked with rope or leather, deft and sure. The rare smile that transformed his face when she managed to start a fire on her first try, or successfully tracked a rabbit through the snow. The sound of his voice in the darkness when they talked late into the night, sharing stories and secrets they had told no one else. She told herself it was foolish to develop feelings for him, that she had just escaped one man's control and should not be eager to fall under another's influence. But Franklin was nothing like Jacob. He treated her with respect, consulted her on decisions, taught her skills that would allow her to be independent. When she made mistakes, he corrected her without anger or contempt. When she succeeded, his approval was genuine and earned. He never touched her without necessity, never looked at her with the possessive hunger that had always frightened her in Jacob's eyes. And yet she found herself wishing he would look at her differently, wondering what it would feel like to have his arms around her for reasons other than steadying her in the saddle or pulling her back from a dangerous ledge. The thought shocked her, made her feel disloyal to herself and to the vow she had made never to depend on a man again. But the heart, she was learning, did not always listen to such vows. 2 weeks into their flight, they stopped to make camp in a narrow canyon where a hot spring steamed in the freezing air. Franklin suggested Victoria take the opportunity to bathe properly, something that had been impossible during their travels. He tactfully retreated to check the horses while she stripped off the layers of clothing and slipped into the hot water. The sensation was extraordinary. Heat seeping into her cold, stiffened muscles and washing away days of grime and sweat. Victoria dunked her head beneath the surface, scrubbing her fingers through her tangled hair, and for a few precious minutes allowed herself to simply exist in the moment without fear or planning or worry. When she emerged and dressed again in the spare set of clothes Franklin had provided, she felt more human than she had since the night she fled independence. Her hair hung wet and loose down her back, and she had reluctantly put the men's clothing back on, but she felt clean and renewed. Franklin was tending the fire when she returned, and he glanced up at her approach. Something flickered in his eyes, an expression she could not quite read, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the flames. Then Franklin cleared his throat and gestured to the pot heating over the fire. "I shot a grouse while you were bathing. It is not much, but better than dried meat." "That sounds wonderful," Victoria said, sitting down across from him. She tried to pin her damp hair back with the few pins she had salvaged, but it was a losing battle. Franklin watched her struggle for a moment, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather cord. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "Use this." Victoria took it gratefully and tied her hair back in a simple tail. When she looked up, Franklin was still watching her, and this time there was no mistaking the warmth in his gaze. "You know, I have been thinking," Franklin said slowly, as if choosing his words with care. "When we get to Nevada, you will not have to stay with my friends if you do not want to. I could help you get set up somewhere on your own, find work maybe, build a new life for yourself. You have learned fast. You are tough enough to make it without anyone's help now." Victoria's heart sank at his words, though she tried not to let it show. Of course he wanted to be rid of her. Why would he want to be saddled with a fugitive woman indefinitely? She had been foolish to imagine anything else. "That is very kind of you," she said carefully. "I appreciate everything you have done for me." Franklin frowned, as if her response was not what he had expected. "I am not trying to get rid of you," he said. "I just want you to know you have choices. You are not obligated to stay with me out of gratitude or because you think you have nowhere else to go. If you want independence, I will help you get it. But if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to travel with me for a while longer, I would not be opposed to that either." Victoria looked up sharply, meeting his eyes. "You want me to stay?" "I've gotten used to having someone to talk to," Franklin said with a slight smile. "Turns out traveling alone is lonelier than I remembered, and you are good company, despite the circumstances that brought us together. So yes, if you wanted to stay, I would welcome it, but only if it is what you want, not because you feel you owe me." Victoria felt warmth spread through her chest, and it had nothing to do with the fire. "I would like to stay," she said quietly, "if you are sure you want me along." "I am sure," Franklin said, and the simple certainty in his voice made her believe him. They ate the grouse in companionable silence, and when they bedded down for the night, Victoria found herself lying awake longer than usual, listening to Franklin's steady breathing from his bedroll a few feet away. Something had shifted between them tonight, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had been ready to name but both had been feeling. She did not know where this path would lead, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was eager to find out. The weather turned brutal again as they descended from the high country toward the Nevada border. They endured 2 more snowstorms, and a night when the temperature dropped so low that Franklin insisted they share blankets and body heat to survive. Victoria had been nervous at first, but Franklin was nothing but respectful, holding her close with the impersonal efficiency of someone focused purely on survival. Still, She could not help but notice the solid strength of his body, the steady beat of his heart against her back, the way his arms encircled her with surprising gentleness. In the morning, they both pretended nothing unusual had happened, packing up camp with their usual efficiency. But Victoria caught Franklin watching her more often, and she found her own gaze drawn to him with increasing frequency. The awareness between them grew with each passing day, an electric tension that made every accidental touch feel significant. They reached the Nevada border on a clear, cold morning in late January. Franklin led them to a small mining camp called Silver Creek, where he had friends who asked no questions about Victoria's past or her relationship to Franklin. They stayed for 3 days, resting the horses and resupplying, sleeping in a real bed in a boarding house that was primitive but felt like luxury after weeks in the wilderness. On their last night in Silver Creek, Franklin invited Victoria to walk with him through the settlement. It was hardly more than a collection of tents and rough buildings clinging to the side of a mountain, but it was alive with noise and activity as miners came off their shifts and headed for the saloons. They walked to the edge of the camp where the lights faded and the forest began, standing side by side and looking out at the vast darkness of the Nevada night. The stars were brilliant overhead, cold and distant, and Victoria pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "I have been thinking about what comes next," Franklin said after a long silence. "We cannot keep running forever. Eventually, you are going to need to decide what kind of life you want to build, and I am going to need to figure out if I can be part of it." Victoria turned to look at him, her heart beating faster. "What do you mean?" Franklin was quiet for a moment, his profile stark against the starlight. "I mean that somewhere along the trail, I stopped thinking of you as a responsibility and started thinking of you as something else entirely. I know it is too soon. I know you have been through hell and probably do not want to hear this, but I need to be honest with you. I care about you, Victoria, more than I have cared about anyone in a very long time. And if you feel even a fraction of the same, then I think we should talk about what that means for both of us." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped, but had not dared to believe that Franklin might feel the same way she did. "I do feel the same," she said softly. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it is too soon and too complicated, and that I should focus on building my own life without depending on anyone. But I cannot seem to help it. You have given me more than survival, Franklin. You have given me hope and strength and the belief that I can be more than I was. I do not want to lose that or lose you." Franklin turned to face her fully, reaching out to cup her face in his calloused hands. "Then do not lose me. Stay with me, not because you need me, but because you want me. Let us build something together, you and I. It will not be conventional, and there will be people who judge us. But I do not give a damn about that if you do not." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, tears of relief and joy and something that felt dangerously close to love. "I do not care what people think," she said fiercely. "I have spent too many years living for other people's approval. All I care about is being free and being with someone who sees me as an equal. If you can give me that, then yes, I want to stay with you. I want to build something with you." Franklin smiled then, a real smile that lit up his entire face, and he leaned down to kiss her. It was nothing like the demanding, possessive kisses Jacob had forced on her. Franklin's kiss was gentle but passionate, asking rather than taking, and Victoria responded with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Victoria felt dizzy with want and wonder. "We should probably get back before we freeze to death," Franklin said, his voice rough. "But this conversation is not over." "I certainly hope not," Victoria replied, and they walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, no longer hiding what they felt from each other or the world. The next morning they left Silver Creek and headed west toward California, not back to Independence but to the Central Valley, where Franklin knew of opportunities for work and land. They traveled as husband and wife now, though they had not yet made it legal, and Victoria found a quiet joy in the pretense that soon might become reality. They worked on a ranch outside of Fresno for several months, Franklin as a hand and Victoria helping the rancher's wife with cooking and housework. It was honest work, and the pay was fair, and slowly they saved money for their own place. Victoria learned to ride better, to work cattle, to shoot accurately with the rifle Franklin bought her. She also learned what it meant to be with a man who respected her, who consulted her on decisions, who shared his fears and hopes without shame. In April, Franklin asked her to marry him properly, with a ring he had saved for and a nervous sincerity that made her laugh and cry at the same time. They were married by a circuit preacher in a small ceremony with only the ranch owners as witnesses, and Victoria wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding she had endured with Jacob, and it was perfect. Their wedding night was spent in a small cabin the rancher let them use, and Victoria was nervous despite her marriage to Jacob. Franklin sensed her hesitation and went slowly, kissing her until she relaxed, touching her with a reverence that made her feel cherished rather than used. When they finally came together, it was nothing like Victoria had expected from her previous experience. There was tenderness and passion, and a deep sense of rightness that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, Franklin held her close and whispered that he loved her, and Victoria whispered it back, knowing she meant it with every fiber of her being. They stayed at the ranch for another year, saving every penny they could, and in the spring of 1880, Franklin bought land outside a small settlement called Riverdale. It was only 40 acres, but it had good water and grass, and there was a small house that needed work but had strong bones. They threw themselves into building their homestead, working from dawn to dusk planting crops, fencing pasture, buying a few cattle and chickens to start. It was hard work, harder than anything Victoria had done before, but she thrived on it. She loved the ache in her muscles at the end of the day, the satisfaction of seeing tangible results from her labor, the knowledge that this was theirs, built by their own hands and sweat. Franklin proved to be a tireless partner, always willing to listen to her ideas, to share the burden equally, to celebrate their small victories with the same enthusiasm as their larger triumphs. In December of 1880, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She had been anxious about telling Franklin, worried that a child would complicate their still precarious situation, but his joy was immediate and unfeigned. He insisted she take on less of the heavy work, despite her protests, and became almost comically overprotective about her health and safety. "I am pregnant, not dying," Victoria said one evening when Franklin tried to prevent her from lifting a water bucket. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while doing far more strenuous work than this." "Not my wife and not my child," Franklin replied stubbornly. "You can argue all you want, but I am not taking chances with either of you." Victoria wanted to be annoyed, but his concern was so transparently loving that she could only kiss him and agree to be more careful. In truth, she was grateful for his attentiveness, especially as the pregnancy progressed and fatigue became a constant companion. Their son was born in August of 1881, a healthy baby boy with dark hair and a lusty cry that announced his arrival to the world. They named him Thomas Franklin Davis, and Victoria fell in love with him the moment she held his tiny, perfect body. Franklin was equally besotted, spending hours simply watching the baby sleep, his weathered face soft with wonder. Motherhood transformed Victoria in ways she had not anticipated. She discovered reserves of patience and strength she had not known she possessed, and she found a fierce protectiveness toward Thomas that made her earlier fight for survival seem pale by comparison. She would do anything to protect her son, to give him the safe and loving childhood she wanted for him. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the homestead prospered. Franklin proved to have a gift for ranching, building their herds slowly but steadily, and Victoria's garden provided most of their food through the long summers. They added a room to the house for Thomas, and then another for a workshop where Franklin could repair equipment and Victoria could do her sewing and preserving. In the spring of 1883, Victoria became pregnant again. This time she was more confident, less worried about what motherhood would mean for her independence. She had proven to herself and to Franklin that she could manage both, could be a mother and a partner and an individual all at once. Their daughter was born in December, right around the anniversary of Victoria's flight from independence 5 years earlier. They named her Sarah Grace Davis, and she was smaller and quieter than Thomas had been, but no less perfect. Franklin held his daughter with visible awe, marveling at her tiny fingers and delicate features, and Victoria felt her heart expand to accommodate this new love. Life settled into a rhythm that was sometimes exhausting but deeply satisfying. The children grew and thrived, Thomas becoming a boisterous and curious boy, Sarah a gentle and observant girl. The ranch continued to expand, allowing them to hire occasional help during busy seasons. Victoria became known in the community as a skilled seamstress and occasionally took in work to supplement their income. Franklin served on the local Cattlemen's Association and earned a reputation as a fair and honest man. Sometimes, late at night when the children were asleep and they lay together in the darkness, Victoria would think about that desperate flight through the snow, about the terrified woman she had been, and the killer she had made herself in order to survive. She never regretted killing Jacob, though the memory still sometimes woke her with nightmares. She had done what was necessary, and it had led her to this life, to Franklin and the children and the freedom she had fought so hard to claim. "You ever regret it?" she asked Franklin one night, her head on his chest and his arm around her shoulders. "Helping me that night, risking everything for a stranger." Franklin was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently stroking her hair. "Not for a single moment," he said finally. "You gave me something I did not know I was missing. Purpose, I suppose, or maybe just a reason to stop drifting. I was so tired of being alone, Victoria, so tired of having no one who cared whether I lived or died. And then there you were, desperate and brave and fighting for your life, and something in me recognized something in you. We saved each other that night, I think." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away. "I love you," she whispered. "I do not say it enough, but I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." "I know," Franklin murmured, kissing the top of her head. "I love you too, always will." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. Thomas grew into a tall, serious boy who loved working with the cattle and had his father's steady hands. Sarah proved to have a gift for numbers and reading, devouring every book they could get her and asking endless questions about the world beyond their small valley. In 1887, Victoria gave birth to another son, James, who was loud and energetic from the moment he drew breath. And in 1890, their youngest daughter Margaret arrived, completing their family of 6. The ranch had grown to over 200 acres by then, with a substantial herd and several hired hands who lived in a bunkhouse Franklin had built. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, able to provide for their children's education and save for the future. Victoria had long since stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped worrying that someone would discover her past and drag her back to face justice for Jacob's death. Independence, California, and that life felt like a distant dream, something that had happened to someone else entirely. In 1895, word reached them through a traveling merchant that Jacob Graham had not died that night after all. He had survived the gunshot wound, though he was crippled and could no longer work. He had told everyone that he had been shot by an intruder, protecting his wife who had subsequently fled in terror. Victoria did not know what to feel about this news. Relief that she was not actually a murderess, perhaps, or anger that Jacob had lied to protect his reputation even after everything. In the end, she decided it did not matter. That life was over and Jacob could not touch her now. "Does it change anything?" Franklin asked when she told him. "No," Victoria said firmly. "I would do it all again exactly the same way. He might not have died, but I was justified in defending myself. And if I had stayed to face the law, I never would have found you. So no, it changes nothing." Franklin kissed her then, deep and fierce, and Victoria kissed him back with the passion of a woman who knew exactly how lucky she was. By the time 1900 arrived, Victoria was 44 years old and Franklin was 51. Their children were growing into young adults, Thomas preparing to take over management of the ranch, Sarah teaching school in Riverdale, and the younger two still at home but showing signs of the people they would become. Victoria looked at her life and saw a legacy she had built from nothing, a family bound by love rather than obligation, a partnership that had weathered storms both literal and figurative. One evening in early December, almost exactly 22 years after that desperate flight through the snow, Victoria and Franklin walked together across their land. The children were all at a dance in town, leaving them alone for a rare evening. They walked in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the sun set over the mountains. "You remember the first thing you said to me?" Victoria asked suddenly. Franklin smiled. "I said you were making a mess of that bridle and that the mare would throw you before you made it a mile." "You were very encouraging," Victoria said dryly, and Franklin laughed. "I was trying to save your life. Encouragement was not high on my list of priorities." "You saved more than my life that night," Victoria said seriously. "You saved my soul, I think. You showed me that I could be strong and independent and still accept help, still be part of something larger than myself. You taught me what love is supposed to look like." Franklin stopped walking and turned to face her, his weathered face tender in the fading light. "You taught me the same things. I was so alone before you, so convinced that I was better off without connections or commitments. You showed me that being alone is not the same as being free. Real freedom is choosing to be with someone because you want to, not because you have to." Victoria reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that time and hard work had etched there. "I choose you," she said softly. "Every day I choose you. And I choose you," Franklin replied. "Every day for the rest of my life." They stood there in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful from shared desperation and hope. Behind them, the lights of their home glowed warm against the night, a beacon of safety and love. Ahead stretched whatever years remained to them. Years they would face together with the same courage and determination that had carried them through that terrible winter so long ago. When snow began to fall, soft and gentle this time, Victoria tilted her face up to catch the flakes on her tongue like a child. Franklin watched her with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his good fortune, and when she laughed and grabbed his hand to pull him into an impromptu dance, He followed without hesitation. They danced there in the snow. No music but the wind and their own breathing. No audience but the stars overhead. Victoria thought about that younger self, running through the darkness with blood on her hands and terror in her heart, and wished she could tell that frightened woman that everything would be all right. That the cowboy who appeared in the stable would lead her to a future she could never have imagined, filled with love and children and a home that was truly hers. The snow continued to fall as they made their way back to the house, covering their tracks just as it had covered Victoria's trail all those years ago. But this time, she was not running from anything. She was running toward everything that mattered, with the man she loved by her side and a life that was rich beyond measure waiting for them both. Inside the warm house, they built up the fire and sat together on the sofa Franklin had made with his own hands. Victoria leaned against his solid warmth, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and allowed herself to be completely content. The past was behind her, buried beneath years of snow and time. The future stretched bright and open ahead. And the present, this moment with Franklin's arms around her and their life surrounding them, was everything she had ever fought for and more than she had ever dared to hope. When the children came home late that night, laughing and full of stories about the dance, they found their parents still curled together on the sofa, Franklin asleep and Victoria drowsing peacefully against his shoulder. Sarah covered them with a blanket and shooed the younger ones to bed, smiling at the picture her parents made. She had heard the story of how they met, or a carefully edited version of it anyway, and she thought it was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. A cowboy rescuing a woman in distress, helping her escape to freedom, falling in love along the way. It was like something out of a storybook, except it was real and it was theirs. In the spring of 1901, Thomas married a girl from a neighboring ranch, and Victoria became a grandmother when their first child was born the following winter. Holding her grandson for the first time, seeing her own eyes reflected in his tiny face, Victoria felt the wheel of life turning in its inevitable cycle. She was no longer the young woman who had fought for her survival in the snow, but she carried that woman inside her still, a reminder of how far she had come and how much she had survived. Franklin remained vigorous well into his 60s, still working the ranch alongside Thomas, though he had officially retired. Victoria watched him with the same love and admiration she had felt from the beginning, perhaps even deeper now for being tested and proven by time. He was still the most capable man she knew, still her partner in every sense of the word. Sarah married a lawyer from Sacramento and moved to the city, though she visited regularly with her husband and children. James took over management of their growing mercantile business in Riverdale, showing a head for commerce that neither of his parents possessed. Margaret, their youngest, surprised everyone by attending the women's college in Berkeley and returning with radical ideas about women's suffrage and social reform. Victoria secretly loved her daughter's fire and independence, seeing echoes of her own younger self in Margaret's fierce determination to change the world. In 1908, Franklin suffered a heart attack while working cattle. He survived, but it weakened him significantly, and he was finally forced to truly retire. Victoria nursed him through his recovery with the same fierce determination she had brought to every challenge in her life, refusing to consider that she might lose him. Franklin recovered enough to move around, though he tired easily and had to give up the heavy work he had always loved. They spent more time together then, sitting on the porch of the house they had built together, watching the sun rise and set over land they had claimed from wilderness. They talked about everything and nothing, content just to be in each other's presence. Victoria read aloud from newspapers and books, and Franklin told stories about his youth and his travels, filling in details he had never shared before. "I need to tell you something," Franklin said one evening in the fall of 1910. They were sitting in their usual spots, wrapped in blankets against the chill, watching the first stars appear. "What is it?" Victoria asked, concerned by his serious tone. "I need you to know that you made my life worth living," Franklin said, his voice rough with emotion. "Before you, I was just existing, going from one day to the next without purpose or joy. You gave me everything that matters: family, home, love, a reason to get up in the morning. I do not know how much longer I have, but I need you to know that every single day with you has been a gift." Victoria felt tears stream down her face, but she smiled through them. "You gave me the same things, more even. You gave me freedom and dignity and the chance to be myself. You saved my life, and then you made it worth living. I love you more than words can possibly express, Franklin Davis, and I always will." Franklin reached for her hand, and they sat in the gathering darkness, holding on to each other and to the life they had built. They had traveled so far from that desperate night in the snow, but in all the ways that mattered, they had been journeying toward this moment all along. Two people who had found each other against all odds and chosen to walk forward together, never looking back at the trails they had left behind. Franklin lived another 5 years, growing gradually weaker, but never losing his sharp mind or his dry humor. Victoria cared for him with the devotion of a lifetime, grateful for every additional day they were granted. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1915, Victoria grieved deeply, but found comfort in their children and grandchildren, and in the knowledge that they had made the most of every moment together. She lived another 12 years, becoming the matriarch of a large and boisterous family, beloved by all who knew her for her strength, her kindness, and her quiet wisdom. She never remarried, never even considered it. Franklin had been her partner, her love, her salvation, and no one could ever replace him. On the anniversary of their first meeting each year, Victoria would walk out to the small family cemetery where Franklin was buried and tell him the news of the year. She would update him on the children's lives, the grandchildren's accomplishments, the changes in the world that seemed to accelerate with each passing year. And she would thank him again for appearing in that stable on a desperate night, for seeing past her fear to the strength beneath, for giving her the chance to become the woman she was meant to be. When Victoria died peacefully in her sleep in 1927 at the age of 71, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her last thoughts were of Franklin and that long-ago night when snow covered the trail behind her, and a cowboy ahead told her not to look back, only forward with him. She had spent her whole life moving forward, building and growing and loving, never regretting the desperate choice that had led her to him. They buried her next to Franklin, under a simple stone that read Victoria Graham Davis, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. The name Graham was a reminder of where she had come from, but Davis was who she had become. Her children and grandchildren stood around the grave and told stories about her courage and kindness, passing down the legend of how their family had begun. Some details had been lost or softened over the years, the violence and desperation smoothed into a more romantic tale, but the essential truth remained. A woman had fought for her freedom, a man had helped her find it, and together they had built something that would endure long after both were gone. The ranch remained in the family for generations, the land they had claimed and cultivated providing for their descendants, just as they had hoped. And on cold winter nights when snow fell thick and heavy, those who lived there sometimes imagined they could see two figures walking hand in hand across the fields, A woman and a man who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to face the light together. Their love enduring beyond death, beyond time, beyond anything that had tried to break them. The snow still covered trails behind and ahead, but it no longer mattered which direction they traveled. They had each other, and that was enough. That would always be enough. They had walked forward together, and in doing so, they had found their way home.